The identities of other nations, say, being French or German, are lost in the mists of time and usually taken for granted. The reason why such nations are having greater problems with immigrants than we are. But Americans became a nation in 1776, and thus, in order to know who we are, we need to know who our founders are. The United States was founded on a set of beliefs and not, as were other nations, on a common ethnicity, language, or religion. Since we are not a nation in any traditional sense of the term, in order to establish our nationhood, we have to reaffirm and reinforce periodically the values of the men who declared independence from Great Britain and framed the Constitution. As long as the Republic endures, in other words, Americans are destined to look back to its founding. By the time Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years following the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, an aura of divinity had come to surround the founding generation. The succeeding generations of Americans were unable to look back at the revolutionary leaders and constitution makers without being overawed by the brilliance of their thought, the creativity of their politics, and the sheer magnitude of their achievement. The founders always seemed larger than life, giants in the earth, a forest of giant oaks, as Lincoln called them, possessing intellectual and political capacities well beyond those who followed them. But this view would not hold, unchanging over time. Lincoln warned that the founders' achievements must fade upon the memory of the world and grow more and more dim by the lapse of time. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, this awe for the founders and their mythical reputation was being questioned, and historians began puncturing the aura of divinity surrounding them. In 1896, a popular historian of the period, John Bach McMaster, wrote an essay entitled "The Political Depravity of the Founding Fathers," in which he contended that in all the frauds and tricks that go to make up the worst form of practical politics, the men who founded our state and national governments were always our equals and often our masters. According to McMaster, the founding generation was not above the worst kinds of political shenanigans, including the silencing of newspapers, the manipulation and destruction of votes, and the creation of partisan gerrymandering. McMaster's muckraking of the revolutionary leaders was only the beginning of what soon became a full-scale campaign. In 1897, Sidney George Fisher attempted to refute William Gladstone's view that the American Constitution was the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man, with his Evolution of the Constitution of the United States, showing that it is a development of progressive history and not an isolated document struck off at a given time or an imitation of English or Dutch forms of government. Fisher thought that the reputation of the founders was so inflated with myths and fables that he devoted his entire career to bringing the events of the American Revolution and its leaders down to earth. In a paper, The Legendary and Myth-Making Process in Histories of the American Revolution, delivered before the American Philosophical Society in 1912, Fisher called for the substitution of truth and actuality for the mawkish sentimentality and nonsense with which we have been so long nauseated. As his contribution, he wrote books with such titles as The True Benjamin Franklin, 1900, and The True History of the American Revolution, 1902. It was the seemingly divinely inspired and democratic character of the Constitution, however, that provoked most revisionist scholars. When progressive reformers at the beginning of the 20th century became increasingly frustrated with the undemocratic character of many of the institutions of the national government, especially a Senate elected by the state legislatures and a life-tenured Supreme Court, professional academics responded by showing that the Constitution not only was not divinely inspired, but was not even a natural expression of American popular democracy. In 1907, J. Allen Smith, in his Spirit of American Government, set forth the emerging view that the Constitution was a reactionary, aristocratic document designed by its checks and balances, difficulty of amendment, and judicial review to thwart the popular will. with more and more scholars in the Progressive era stressing the undemocratic nature of the Constitution, the way was prepared for the historiographical explosion that Charles Beard made in 1913 with An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. Beard's book, which was part of the revolt against formalism occurring everywhere in the Western world in those years, became the most influential history book ever written in America. It came to represent and dominate an entire generation's thinking about history and especially about the origins of the Constitution. By absorbing the diffused thinking of Marx and Freud and the assumptions of behaviorist psychology, Beard and others of his generation came to conceive of ideas as rationalizations, as masks obscuring the underlying interests and drives that actually determined social behavior. For too long, it seemed, historians had detached ideas from the material conditions that produced them and had invested them with an independent power that was somehow alone responsible for the determination of events. As Beard pointed out in the introduction to the 1935 edition of his Economic Interpretation, previous historians of the Constitution had assumed that ideas were entities, particularities, or forces, apparently independent of all earthly considerations coming under the head of economic. Beard, like many of his contemporaries, sought to bring to the fore those realistic features of economic conflict, stress, and strain that previous historians had ignored. By suggesting that the framers of the Constitution were motivated by their underlying economic interests, Beard removed the mantle of disinterested virtue that they had traditionally been wrapped in. However crude and mistaken Beard's particular findings have turned out to be, his underlying assumption that people's consciousness and ultimately their behavior were the products of their social and economic circumstances had a lasting effect on American historical scholarship. After Beard's book, debunking of the myths and legends surrounding the founding generation became increasingly popular. Because George Washington had been especially subject to mythologizing, he was often singled out for deflating. Indeed, in the 1920s, the popular writer W.E. Woodward invented the word debunk to describe the process of revealing the unattractive qualities of particular characters, and Washington became one of his favorite targets. Given this century-long tradition of deflating the reputations of the founders, we should not be surprised by any current criticism of the revolutionary generation. Precisely because these founders have become so important to Americans, so central to our sense of who we are, there is a natural tendency to use them as a means of criticizing America and its culture. If one wants to condemn, say, America's treatment of minorities or its imperialistic behavior, there is no better way than to bash one or more of the founders. Indeed, demonizing the founders, especially Jefferson, has become something of a cottage industry over the past 40 years or so. Although criticizing the founding generation has been going on for more than a century, there does seem to be something new and different about the present-day academic vilification. Historians' defaming of these elite white males seems much more widespread than it used to be. Sometimes this criticism has taken the form of historians purposely ignoring the politics and the achievements of the founders altogether, as if what they did were not all that important. Instead, as has been pointed out, much of the best work on the history of the early republic during the past several decades has concentrated on recovering the lost voices of ordinary people. A midwife in Maine, or a former slave in Connecticut, or on emphasizing the popular cultural matrix of the period that transcends the leadership of the great white males. Of course, historians with no connection to academia or no interest in esoteric academic debates continue to write histories and biographies of the founders that are widely popular. But academic historians over the past 40 years have tended to focus on issues of race, class, and gender in the early republic, and to shun issues of politics and political leadership. When the founders are not ignored but confronted directly, present-day criticism of them is much more devastating than that of the past. Despite his exposing of what he took to be the founders' underlying economic motives, Beard always respected the men who framed the Constitution. Never in the history of assemblies, he wrote in 1912, has there been a convention of men richer in political experience and in practical